Salam, dear friends of BookBytes. We're ending the season this evening with something absolutely delightful. If you've ever been through the school system, looked for books for young ones, or read something or looked for something entertaining for yourself, you've definitely heard of local, homegrown South African author and well-loved children's author, Jaco Jacobs. His latest being, this is a book about fairies or monsters, let's decide, because there's a very sneezy monster in here and probably a smattering of fairies. Jaco Jacobs has written close to 300 books. Many have been translated in various languages. He's also a translator of books from the Dutch and English into Afrikaans. While he primarily writes in Afrikaans, he's got some really groundbreaking and award-winning books in English as well. And they've received not just local but global recognition in various forms of expression, because some of the books like Sirlemoen, the novella, had been turned into feature film along with other works. So if you've written close to 300 books, disseminated over 1 million books, and written so widely and are so well loved by readers locally and abroad, then what a big celebration for us to have none other than Jaco Jacobs on the show tonight. Welcome to BookBytes, Jaco, and thank you for giving us your time this evening.
Shafinaaz, thank you very much. It's a big honor being on your show. My family and I are on the way back from holidays, so I'm in a guest house at the moment, but it's wonderful being able to chat this way.
I love the idea that we can reach out to you and get a few minutes of you, especially when I've read some of the most delightful work. And I know my niece was very excited. She's a huge fan. And when she was asked to celebrate, I think in September they had a book week at school, and she was asked to celebrate a local writer. And she chose to feature you. So she's right now very excited about this show. Let's get right into it. I mean, delightful writing. You've made a lifelong not just a career, but a commitment to this. This is the love, the passion that you have that shows out over maybe more than 2 decades. Speak to us about where this began for you and what drives you through the process of creating such beautiful stories.
Thanks for the wonderful words. I grew up in a small Karoo town. It was one of those, it literally had no traffic lights, had 1 or 2 tarred roads. But there was one thing in that town that was absolutely amazing, and that was the library. And I remember as a young boy, when I started learning to read, devouring every book in that library, from the kiddies' picture books up to the adult books when I was in high school. And that's obviously, I think for most authors, that's where it starts. I grew up in a family of storytellers. My grandmother could recite every poem that she ever learned in school. My grandfather could tell the most amazing ghost stories. I think growing up in those surroundings, growing up with stories, getting to love stories, was where my love for writing and creating stories started. But when I was at school, I started writing in school, and I didn't originally plan on writing for kids. I wanted to become the next big Afrikaans writer for adults. And I started off my career by writing for adults, writing short stories for Afrikaans magazines when I was in high school. And then one day, one of the editors at one of these Afrikaans magazines, one of the big magazines, contacted me and said, we like your work, but I suspect you're supposed to write children's books. Your voice, the stories you are interested in, I think will work for children's books. And I was a bit taken aback. I thought, wow, well, that's not what I was planning on doing. But I went back to the library, and then I started rereading some of the stuff that I wrote, that I read as a kid, the books that I grew up loving. And I had a lot of fun with it. And I decided, well, I'm going to give it a go. And then that long holiday after you write matric, while the rest of my classmates were off partying or enjoying their summer off, I sat down and I started writing my first novel for teenagers. And it was like everything just fell in place. It was like I could have so much fun writing in this genre and writing for kids. And like you said, I've never looked back. This has become my passion. I love creating books for young people and becoming part of their world, and hopefully doing my bit to make them fall in love with reading and with the wonderful books, the wonderful world of books that I grew up with.
Well, do you think it's more difficult writing for adults or writing for children?
Um, some authors, I can't remember who, but someone once said you have to write the same way. When you write for children, you have to write the same way you do for adults, only better. I don't know if that's really true, but I think it's more a matter of doing what you were meant to do. For me, to go and sit down and write a novel for adults, a novel of 500 or 600 pages would be close to impossible. I would bore myself to death writing a story that's long. I like writing something that's fast paced and entertaining myself. And I have a short attention span when it comes to writing a book. So I think it's not a matter of how difficult it is to write for children or to write for adults. Um, some of the most famous novelists that I know in Afrikaans have told me that they can't imagine sitting down and writing a story spanning 500 words. So I think it's just what you were made to do, finding your voice and finding the genre that makes you tick.
Well, I mean, you clearly understand your reader. You have a nuanced way of getting into the mind of your reader, and that's been part of your success, close to 300 books or more later. The test of writing, sort of not just genre specific, but now age appropriate, right? So you've got these challenges of what we had in the 90s was that we didn't have a lot of local material that our kids could identify with or that we could identify with. Um, and now you've created this incredible genre. You've made this huge contribution to children's literature in South Africa, perhaps even created a reader from your work. What has the total journey been like? Have you seen evolution and what has that been like as you feel the process? I don't think perhaps it's not been as linear as my mind might make out.
Um, yeah, that's a difficult question. When I started out writing, as you said, the teenage market was, especially the market for teenage books in Afrikaans and in South Africa, was very limited. And in Afrikaans, many kids were starting off reading Afrikaans and then drifting off and becoming readers in English. And I was lucky to meet my publisher, who's been my publisher for more than 20 years, Mimi Duplessis, at the time when she started her publishing career, her career as a publisher. And Mimi came from a background in the library services, so she knew a lot about what was going on, internationally, but also locally. And she was passionate about filling all those gaps in terms of what was being published locally. And I think I was so amazingly lucky to start my career at that time because Mimi sat me down and said, "Listen, this is what we need. We need books that don't preach to kids, books that aren't just meant to teach kids stuff. We want them to enjoy reading. We want them to have fun with reading because at the time in Afrikaans, books were to a certain degree very didactic. They were stern and they were aimed at education, and they were. I think, in a certain sense, many of the books that were being published felt like work to kids, and we wanted to stop that. We wanted to take away that sense of when you pick up a book, you have to learn something from it. You have to learn to read. Books should be part of your schoolwork. You should have, when you read a book, you have to answer questions about it. We wanted kids to pick up a book because they couldn't wait to find out what happens next, or because they love the characters and they identify with the characters. And what Mimi was also passionate about was reflecting different cultures, the variety of South African cultures in our books. And we sat down and we did that. In terms of genre, we started publishing more picture books, more books of poetry. So I was very lucky, as I said, that she knew this genre so well and she knew what she wanted to add to the market. And I, as an author, enjoyed you know these challenges of creating these books. And as I've said, I have a short attention span, so I love jumping from one genre to the other. I love the challenge of creating my first picture book or creating my first book of poetry. And whenever a challenge like that is thrown my way, I delve into it. I go and study as many different books in that genre as I can, um, to make sure that you create the best that you can in this genre, and hopefully, create a body of work that will make kids loved reading.
No, I think I speak for every reader in South Africa, anyone who's been through the system or looked for books for their kids, that this contribution is not a small contribution at all. And we really commend you and thank you for that. I mean, you've really engaged the power of imagination, not just bringing out a child's imagination, but knowing that children don't see a sofa or a chair. They see a rocking horse when they look at your dining room chair. And you've put yourself in that child and in the mind of that child and engaged imagination to that degree. You clearly have fun with this. Talk to us about your process. I mean, I know you have already touched on it to a degree, but talk to us about process when it really comes to putting yourself in the mind of your reader.
Um, I think if I gave you the short answer, it would probably be what my publisher always tells me. Mimi always tells me she thinks in my mind I'm about between 9 and 11 years old, and I think sometimes my wife agreed with her. Um, but to give you a more honest answer, I love playing. In a certain sense, I don't think I've ever grown up, and that's what I do when I sit down and write. I start playing. I start writing stories for the young boy that I was. The boy who loved scary stuff, or as you've said, loved playing with his imagination. The other day, I was telling my kids. I had a new book of Afrikaans poetry out, and there's a poem about what would happen if ostriches could fly. Now, that's the kind of stuff that I do. Whenever we've been on a road trip this past 2 weeks, like you said, and whenever we are driving somewhere, I will, that's boring time. You're sitting in the car and you're driving for kilometers and kilometers, and that's when I start playing around in my head. And I distinctly remember 2 years ago when we were on this same December holiday, we were driving through the Karoo, and there were ostriches standing by the side of the road. And I thought, what would literally happen if ostriches could fly? They would be a proper nuisance. Imagine waking up in the morning and there was a flock of ostriches in your garden. What would happen to the electricity system in this country if ostriches would sit down on electric wires? And that's the sort of stuff that I keep playing over and over in my head. And I tell my kids that as well. We love playing these sort of creative games while we're driving. And that's as easy as it is. It's just keeping awake that sense of wonder, that sense of imagination, that sense of playfulness with wherever you're going. During the COVID pandemic, just when the restrictions were being lifted, I remember for the first time in my life, I joined a gym because some friends invited me along. And in the mornings, I went for my usual jogging routine. I went jogging, but I jogged to the gym. I ran 5 kilometers to the gym. Then I trained with them and I ran back. And every morning, well, it was always the same time. Every morning, there was just this gentleman along the way that I passed while I was running. And he was dressed in this formal gray suit, walking along to work, I suppose. And then he was singing opera. Like, I'm not a music boffin, but he was singing opera in this huge booming voice and obviously enjoying himself immensely. But the moment I passed him, he would keep dead quiet and pretend that nothing happened. And I didn't want to embarrass him, so I said nothing. And it happened 5 or 6 times. I would run past, and when he supposed I was out of earshot, he would start up again. And that's the kind of thing that amazes me. And I'm sure I'm going to use that guy in a story someday. So it's just about being playful and about keeping that childish thing alive of wondering about things and being amazed at things.
I feel like, when you read these stories about how when you're in the flow state, when you're in a state of creativity and you're receptive to the possibilities and these stories follow you, I'm quite sure these stories actually follow you. So that's amazing to hear. I really appreciate that sharing. I wonder how many people have passed someone on the road singing in opera, but that's just an incredible story. We look forward to seeing what you do with that. And I think that's just it, right? There's these seeds of story everywhere if we really care to look. And South Africa is like this melting pot of potential, of story potential. And the fact that you're harvesting it so successfully and bringing it to us is beyond commendable. What can we look forward to from your pen? I'm sure there's, stories in the pipelines, as you said, while you're on your road trip. I remember we used to try to make stories with the clouds when we were on a road trip. So, I mean, what is it that while you're retaining this childlike wonder that we hope to see in the future from your pen?
Yes, the wonderful thing about the publishing industry is that it's actually easy to tell you what's in the pipeline, because most of the books that are getting published in 2025 have already been written and are being illustrated at the moment. Some of them have even been laid out. So if I have a quick thing for next year, there's a new series coming out, a new series for boys, um, which is about two guys who keep ending up in all sorts of trouble. I have a big book coming out next year, and with big, I mean long in terms of pages. I told you I don't have a long attention span. So this past year, I wrote one of the most challenging books I've ever written. Um, I don't want to get too much away about it, but it's a fantasy story about a boy who discovers he's been a bit of a down and out character, and then he discovers that he has an amazing ability. And there is a very rich woman who wants him to come to an island to protect a very endangered bird that she is keeping on this island. The book is called The Lightning Bird. It's being published in Afrikaans and in English simultaneously. So I'm looking forward to that one very, very much. I had so much fun writing it, but it was a very challenging story to write because it's something completely different from what I've ever done. And then there are also, I think, two new picture books coming out, which I am looking forward to very much.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to them as well. And the idea that, I mean, you're writing stories that are proudly South African, they're local, and they have that local feel. How have your stories and books been received outside of South Africa, not just in the continent, but in other parts of the world? What has the feedback been like? And yeah.
It's actually a very surreal feeling getting your books published in other countries. Um, the first of my books that was published overseas was a book called A Good Day for Climbing Trees, which was published a few years ago in Great Britain, and then subsequently published in Italian and in Slovenian and in Dutch. And getting the English book published overseas is usually the most challenging part of being published overseas, because the English translation is the first one that that gets published overseas. So that's where all the difficult things get ironed out. Stuff like I never realized that overseas they don't know. Like Oma Rusk that we have that we dip in our coffee is a totally strange thing overseas. So we had to come up with something else for the English market. What happened with the Italian translation or whatever, I have no idea, because then you sort of get cut out of the process. Then they work with the English publisher. But I must say the response has been incredible from overseas. People are very, you said South Africa has wonderful stories, and people overseas are really eager to read these stories, to get these stories published. And they love stories that have a distinctly South African flavor. I think some of the best reception my books has garnered was in the Netherlands. I think I had two, three or four books published there now. And it's amazing how alive their children's book market is. The moment one of my books get published there are heaps of reviews coming in the newspapers and so on, which we tend to lack in South Africa, unfortunately. We don't have that literary system that they have. So it's really exciting, getting your work out to a larger audience and seeing the reception that it gets there. But it's also a daunting experience. Every time I see one of my books being translated, being reviewed in an Italian newspaper, and I use Google Translate to see what they're writing about it, I'm a bit astounded to think I'm sitting at my desk writing these stories, for myself. I told you I write for the kid that I was, and seeing these stories spreading their wings and going overseas. Sometimes I think, oh my word, is anyone overseas going to actually read and enjoy these stories? But I'm just so blessed to be able to do this, to have fun doing this and to see it reaching a larger audience.
You've also your books have gone onto the big screen, right? So you've got the novella Sirilumun, which became a feature film. Do you think that appeals to a different audience, to the same audience that's reading the book, and what has the reception been like with that?
That's a great question. It's difficult to say. I think what happens when a book gets adapted into a feature film is you get two different audiences. And on the one side, you get kids who read the book as a prescribed text or has read it for enjoyment, and they go and see the movie, to see what the characters look like on screen and what they did with the story uh, and so on. And then you get a totally new audience, people who aren't necessarily readers, kids who aren't readers, parents of kids who go and see the movie and they haven't read the book. So it's an interesting experience seeing your book adapted to the big screen. I don't like screenwriting. I've written two feature films for television, but I don't really enjoy the process of writing a screenplay. So both of my books that have been adapted into feature films have been adapted by other writers. I decided to, I wrote the best book that I could, and I gave it over into the hands of someone who's a very good screenwriter. In both cases, I was very impressed with the end result. So I think, to answer your question, I think the great thing about a book being adapted into a feature film is that it sort of broadens the audience for the story. And it's interesting to see what they do with the story. They take out all the strongest story parts of your story and add to that and sort of take the essence out of the story when they make it into a movie.
I think it's wonderful that we can have that opportunity. That storytellers can have that opportunity, that creatives can have that collaboration where you're able to see the story in its written form and take a very different route and a different sort of manifestation in the form of a feature film as well. And now I want to pick up on something you said earlier. You said you write for the child that you were, the child who would have wanted to read these stories, perhaps. And I find that a lot of parents, a lot of adults who are reading children's stories to their children, when a story is really good, it doesn't even have to have a moral, it can be purely entertaining. I think in some ways these stories speak to us, to our inner child. In some ways, you're also giving back to the adults who would have wanted to read and experience the entertainment of those stories. So I want to just add that dimension and say you're speaking to all of us. Books for children and their children. That's what I want to say these books are. What are your hopes, Jaco? What are your hopes for the future of storytelling in South Africa, for children's writing, and for children to be able to open the door in so many ways?
I think if we look at South Africa, the thing that I hope the most strongly for is that we can um, get a stronger reading culture in this country. It's really terrible to see how bad South African children are doing in international literary studies. This past week or past 2 weeks, it's been in the newspaper how bad children are doing in mathematics compared to children worldwide. South African children are really struggling. And the problem with their maths is if you can't read, you can't do any school subject, including mathematics. And a few years ago, not too long ago, it was once again proven that South African grade fours, has the lowest literacy level of any group of kids that were tested in Africa. So that is really, really terrifying if you think about it. So I really hope we can get schools, parents, all sorts of organizations together and do something about this crisis. And I think, and it really is a crisis, it's a pandemic of illiteracy. And from my point of view, you can either sit down and be depressed about this, or you can get excited and see this as an opportunity, to make kids love reading again, to make them excited about stories, to tell them, listen, hey, this is not just about schoolwork. This is about picking up a book and meeting new characters that you are going to love, reading a story that you can't wait to see what it's going to end like. But we need a serious discussion on all levels of education about how we are going to make kids love reading again.
I think you've made a huge dent in that, and the material is there. Just if one has to look at your own body of work and the various material that comes through local writing, a broader perspective would be an appeal to government to get involved. Subsidize costing to make access, make books more accessible to the reading public. And I take your point. You've raised some very, very important points about literacy levels in our country, and about what needs to be done, because there's certain organizations working with limited resources that we need to join hands with. The material is certainly there, which is why we're so honored to have you online this evening. Parting words and any advice for writers who want to put their stories out there, parents who are raising readers.
The best advice for any writer, I can sum up in 2 sentences. First of all, read, read, read. Whether you are a parent who would like to become a children's book author, or you have a kid who is interested in writing, tell them to read as much as they can. Read the kind of books that they love. Get to know which genres we enjoy, which authors you enjoy. So read, 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 and secondly, write, write, write. You have to go and sit down and write as much as you can. I often have people coming up to me and saying, I want to write a children's book. I would love to write a children's book. And I ask them, well, what are you writing at the moment? Why aren't you writing? What's keeping you from doing it? So read, 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 and write, write, write. That's the only way. You have to have something that you can pitch to a publisher. And it's not going to happen if you don't go and sit down and start doing it.
I think if we can kill self-doubt, and if we can engage that childlike nature, that wonder, retain that wonder no matter how old we get, then you've given us basically a masterclass this evening in how to engage story, how to write, and how to really, really pass on that love of reading to our children. Jaco, thank you so much for your time this evening. We wish you every success on your journey on this road trip and every story to tell in the future.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful speaking to you.
And so that was some of the most fun I've had speaking to local author, well-loved children's author, Jaco Jacobs. On tonight's show of Book Bites, we end this season with so much delight and so much celebration, knowing that we've had the most amazing books coming out of the local industry, authors that are really, really passionate and engaged in getting a love of reading, not just for older readers, but for younger readers, as I said, for children and their children. We hope you have a beautiful, safe, festive season. You keep safe on the roads, and that you're really, really enjoying our local stories and passing them down to our children. And don't forget, Jaco Jacobs' message is retain that childlike wonder. And that's it from us on Book Bites this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.